Eula was an extremely hyped character and was touted by some to be one of the top tier DPSs, and it's easy to see why. She absolutely has the highest DPS in the game, although I do mean damage per screenshot, not damage per second. As time went on, however, more and more top tier damage dealers have been released, and Eula has fallen off from being top tier. That being said, many people have the misconception that her damage is bad, or she can't full star the abyss, or that her physical element holds her back. And all these things are either only partially true or just not true at all. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Eula is an on-field DPS with extremely high multipliers, a high field time requirement, high team support requirements, and high investment requirement. Eula is a jealous mistress that requires your unyielding love, dedication, and life savings. Her team damage is basically directly proportional to how much you invest into her in basically every way possible. But let's first talk about her teams. She has a few different team variations. This one is my favorite, although ideally I would be trading Layla for Zhongli here. I just haven't gotten Zhongli just yet. As soon as he comes back, I will. And Shenhe or Constellation 6 Rosaria are your best choices for this final slot. And if you don't have Constellation 6 Rosaria, it'll still be really good, but you get additional further physical res shred from Rosaria at C6, and Shenhe gives you physical res shred with her burst, as well as normal and charge attack damage with her skill. So Shenhe's actually about an equally good cryo partner for your Eula. The best way to think about Eula's teams is putting pieces of the puzzle together, and the result that you want is generally reduced physical resistance and a lot of cryo energy and enough defensive utility to sustain Eula so that you don't have to be dodging while you're on field with her, because she basically needs to spend enough time doing her full combo to get max damage. The most common way to fill the first puzzle piece, which is reducing physical resistance, is going to be with your Electro character. The best Electro character is probably Raiden, depending on how well you have her built, but if you don't have Raiden, Fischl is a really excellent choice as well, especially for single target. When you start getting into AoE, Raiden's damage will outpace Fischl. Raiden is always generally a bit better of a choice in terms of overall team damage, but in single target, Fischl is really close, if not about on par. Fischl doesn't really change how you build the team too much. It will change how you play the team because you're not spending on-field time with Raiden. So that's generally your second slot is the Electro character. Your third slot is going to be your cryo damage dealer and battery, so your Shenhe or Rosaria generally. And then your last slot is usually going to be your defensive option, whether that be Zhongli being the premier choice or Layla and Diona being other good choices as well. You can also trade either of these last two slots for Mika, especially if you have a high constellation Mika, especially C6. For your various high damaging team, I believe Mika should be in the Chongyun slot here and Zhongli should be in the Layla slot. I think this is the highest damaging team, but C6 Rosaria and Shenhe are very close for this slot. You can also put Mika in the last slot. Another option you have is to put Kuki as your defensive option and then use two damaging cryo options such as Shenhe and Rosaria in the last two slots. This is nice because you get both the physical res shred from Rosaria and Shenhe, and you get Shenhe, Rosaria, and Eula utilizing the quills from Shenhe. So this is actually a pretty good team, but in general, you'd rather have this slot be a damaging slot like Fischl, as the damage is generally just better. You also have the option of foregoing an Electro slot entirely and putting Zhongli into this slot, and then either having Rosaria and Shenhe together, or Mika in one of these last two slots. The reason why you can get away with this, especially with Rosaria at C6, is because you'll have the physical res shred from Shenhe and from Rosaria and from Zhongli, and Eula in her kit gives physical res shred itself. Because of all that, you don't necessarily 100% need the superconduct reaction because you don't need quite that much. Finally, for her traditional teams, you're also able to slot in other flex slots such as Yelan or Xingqiu. Yelan in particular has pretty good synergy with Eula because her Eula's going to be proccing her swords with normal attacks. You're going to be getting some freezes on the enemy, which can help with defensiveness or just hitting all of your stacks with Eula. Plus, Yelan's ramping damage bonus has a lot of good synergy with Eula's backloaded damage, being the big burst at the end of her at the end of her stacks. And that leads me to Eula's final team, which is Eula Hyperbloom. Now, I would say that this team's niche is that it's Eula's best low investment team. So a lot of people like to say that Eula's best team is Hyperbloom, which is true and also isn't true. It's true in the sense that if your Eula's not particularly well invested, if she's just averagely invested, then this actually will be her best team because Hyperbloom has such a high floor, and there is some relatively okay synergy with Eula in particular on this team. For one thing, you're going to be having Kuki applying Electro, meaning you're going to get some super conducts, meaning Eula will have some super conducts. If you're using someone like Yelan, you still get that ramping damage bonus for Eula, so you're still buffing Eula's burst. And so overall, there is some synergy for her with this team. It's definitely not my favorite Hyperbloom team by a shot, and it's not my favorite Eula team either. It's not as satisfying because you won't be able to build as much damage for Eula. You'll have to most likely go for an energy recharge Sands. There's no way you get enough ER substats to reliably get Eula's burst every rotation. I would definitely recommend, using as much Favonius as you can on this team. As far as when exactly the break point is as to when this team is better or worse than Hyperbloom, my Eula is really well built, and in general, I feel like she performs about the same with this Hyperbloom team and with her other team in single target. In multi-target, regular Eula will generally just perform better all the time. When looking at damage calculations for this team, it's versus regular Eula teams, it's not as simple as just saying Hyperbloom is the better team with her, because whenever you're doing damage calculations, you have to pick some kind of standard, right? You have to pick, say, this is the artifact quality that we're basing our calculations on. And if you're a Eula main, Eula is a jealous mistress that demands everything from you. And if you divorce her, she will take your kids, not a question. So a really dedicated Eula main, you're not going to be having an average Eula build. It is not worth going for Eula if you're just going to build her average. You're either all in or just don't bother. So let's talk about Eula's strengths and weaknesses then. I would say her number one strength is also one of her bigger weaknesses, is that high investment into Eula gives you higher returns into this character. Another way to say that would be vertical investment, and it doesn't necessarily mean in constellations and 5-star weapons, although it does include that, but it's also going to be artifact quality, talent levels, level, etc. And we'll talk more about that in the build guide. But because of for Eula teams, a really, really large portion of the team damage is going to be coming from Eula. The more you invest or don't invest in Eula, the better or worse the team is going to perform as a whole. Whereas other characters, more reaction-based teams, the investment is going to be more spread out between the teams and is going to be based on maybe easier to get artifacts. It's somewhat harder to get really good artifacts for Eula than some other characters. The other big pro I would say for Eula is that no enemies are immune to physical. So while my Raiden gets, no matter how much I invest in Raiden, even if I got her C2, she gets hard-walled by the Thundering Manifestation on floor 2, so there's just no option for me bringing Raiden. For Eula, although there are things that make her life difficult, nothing is truly immune to physical. So if you invest enough into your Eula, she can clear any content, which has some value. The other pros I would say is that she's really fun. Backloading that damage and that really, really big burst of damage is really, really fun. And it does allow for some creativity. And if you're almost about to kill the enemy, you can swap off early and detonate your burst early so that you don't waste damage and waste time. She's very, very front loaded. So if you're able to kill the enemies really efficiently, like right after you burst down, you can bring your clear times down significantly. You also have the option of building less crit rate and relying more on resetting until you crit. So I don't go all the way, right? I'm not gonna do 40 crit rate or 30 crit rate or something like that. But generally I'll have Cryo Resonance active because I'm using 2 cryo characters plus Eula, so there's a fair bit of cryo application. And so this amount of crit rate, I'm going just on the lower side because so much of her damage comes from one big shot that if I miss my first crit, I just reset the chamber. And because of that, I'm able to build a lot more crit damage, and therefore I'm basically able to cheese out extra damage out of Eula that you can't necessarily do from characters that require consistent attacks. You can reset a 50% chance or a 75% chance or a 60. Mine is about a 75% chance with Cryo Resonance. But if you're using, Yoimiya, for example, you can't reset if you miss all of your crits because she's hitting so many times. You know, you can't reset with that. For her cons, so I would say that she is situational. Is her biggest con. Situational in the places that she really shines. So for example, it's kind of similar to how Yoimiya really only shines in single target, or Tainari really only shines in single target. Eula best shines in basically when there's 2 or 3 enemies and they're aggro, so they go towards you. So she actually does pretty well against Consecrated Beasts, against Triple Magu Kenki, against those 2 Enkanomiya Vishaps. Those types of enemies she actually does pretty well against, because they kind of aggro to you and you're able to build up your stacks and then detonate and do AoE damage to both of them. She doesn't work that well in mobs when characters are spread out, or even enemies that like to ungroup themselves or hide, like Whopper Flowers or dogs, or like the Weenut or something like that. Enemies that hide, it's hard for her because she can't necessarily always build up her stacks. She needs to hit all of her stacks on her normal attack for her burst to detonate with the most damage. So mobile enemies, spread out enemies, invulnerability phases as well, although invulnerability phases can be worked around more easily than other things, as well as elemental shields. She has a hard time breaking elemental shields and hard time slotting in flex slots to break elemental shields, but she is a Claymore character, so her heavy attacks do slowly whittle away weaker elemental shields especially. She also lacks synergy with grouping characters like Kazuha, similar to how Mono Geo, like you can put Kazuha in there, but he doesn't swirl physical, so you're not going to increase physical damage with that. And then the final con is that she has really high energy recharge requirements, and as such you often need to run 1 or 2 or 3 batteries on your team to be able to get Eula enough particles to get her burst back right away for every rotation. So with that all being said, let's talk about how to get that energy and how to build her properly. So starting with level, is she worth leveling to 90? Now generally I would say no, but again, Eula has expensive tastes. If you're choosing Eula, you are choosing to invest into it. You're choosing to marry Eula. Eula is one of those girls that you do not go for a one-night stand with. She is one of those girls that requires the utmost dedication and a lifelong commitment before she will perform for you. So if you are a Eula main, 90 out of 90 you're Eula. I know it doesn't make sense. I know you might say to me, Jello, I can level 90 my Kuki. I could level 90 my Nahida. I could level my Alhaitham, because they get more out of it. You must level 90 your Eula if you play Eula. I'm not a Eula main, so my Eula is still at level 80. But if you're a Eula main, you need to level 90 your Eula. For talents, you need to double crown your Eula. I'm a fake Eula main, so I have crowned her burst, but not her normal attack. If you're a true Eula main, you need to crown her normal attack. You don't need to crown her skill. Getting it to level 8 or 9 should be fine. But if you're a Eula main, you need to crown her normal attack and your burst. Your burst is a huge portion of her damage, but your normal attack is not too shabby either. I think it's around 40% of her damage comes from her normal attacks. So I highly recommend getting your normal attack to at least level 9. And then definitely absolutely 100% crowning her burst. Her burst has it has a ton of scaling. For weapons, okay, let's talk about our weapons. Wolf's Gravestone, great. Unforged, great. Skyward Blade is actually pretty good if you need the ER. If your substats have lots of ER, then don't go with Skyward Blade. But if you don't have any, it's going to be good. Stone Thresher, good. I think Beacon of the Red Sea is great. I think Stone Thresher should probably go in here. Serpent Spine is really excellent, especially if you have high refinements. At R5, this weapon goes up to here, as long as you're using it with a shielder. You also need to use a shielder with the Unforged. This is pretty much what I would say for her weapons. I know that the Snow Tomb does have pretty good synergy with her. You could argue that it's solid, and I think you could argue that this one's good too. Maybe it's something like this, but generally, if you have one of any of these weapons, your Eula is going to be good. There's going to be people in the comments correcting me on my weapon guide here. The moral of the story is if you choose one of these weapons, it's going to be solid. I would generally recommend the Serpent Spine or one of the 5-star weapons, or a high refined Akumaru if you can. And if you're a Eula main, you will get her a 5-star weapon or an R5 Serpent Spine. That's just what Eula deserves and requires. But definitely check out the comments for people's thoughts on the actual ranking of these weapons. I know that these are all good, and I know this one is a bit of a step behind the others. For artifacts, your best choice, and really your only choice, is the 4-piece Pale Flame. While you're farming for the 4-piece Pale Flame, or If Eula isn't your #1 priority right now, in which case, make sure you don't say that out loud because Eula is listening, you can absolutely farm for the 4-piece or the 2-piece Bloodstained Chivalry set and use a 2-piece Bloodstained and Pale Flame. Pale Flame is undoubtedly the best, but I've went going for a 2-piece because my Bloodstained pieces are really quite good. For the artifact stats, one thing to note is unlike most other bonuses, you actually get a 25% bonus for the 2-piece as opposed to a 20% which most sets will give you. So that's, as opposed to only a 15% that most other sets will give you. So you're actually getting a bit more value out of her 2-piece than other 2-piece for other elements. So that's really, really nice. You're basically just looking for the highest value crit rate and crit damage you possibly can, and enough energy recharge as well. You're dedicating yourself to live in the Pale Flame domain and putting up a shrine there, hoping and praying to whatever god you believe in that Hoyoverse will add Pale Flame to the strongbox in the next patch. Good luck. For constellations, this is a big one and this is a hot topic, and I generally do never ever recommend going for weapons or constellations. And even for Eula, I do recommend either just going for the battle pass weapon or waiting until you get a Wolf's Gravestone from the standard weapon, because both of these are going to be really, really great for her and not that far behind other 5-star weapons. But for constellations, her first and second constellation give pretty decent value, about a 10 and 20% increase in her damage respectively, and a 10 and 20% increase in her damage is a 10 and 20% increase in team damage from her constellations, which is really, really, really big. I wouldn't recommend you go for it. I would recommend you just live in her artifact domain and build her up really, really big. But if you're already married to Eula, then you're not interested in any other characters, and then constellations might be something you actually want to go for. And if you do, hers are quite good. Obviously, her C6 is insane and really opens up some team building and flexibility. She can be more of a burst support at C6 and do absolutely cracked out crazy numbers, but I am not telling you to go for C6. She's perfectly fine at C0, but she will require your full dedication. Because if you think about this, right, yes, Raiden is going to be some damage in this team, but since there's nothing really in this team aside for Zhongli, if you're running it in Layla's slot, is really buffing Raiden at all. So she's not a significant portion of this team's damage. Eula is actually doing like 70 to 80% of the team damage. And so every stat you invest into Eula is, you're almost getting a 1-to-1 increase in team damage. Whereas if I'm using a team like Yoimiya with Yelan, Yelan is doing a ton of the team damage as well on top of Yoimiya. And even Kazuha is doing some pretty solid damage as well. In a national team, 3 out of these 4 characters are doing tons of damage, right? And that goes for most teams. But for Eula, she really is the star of the show. And as the performer and dancer she is, it only makes sense. I would say the #1 thing that could help Eula feel better to play in more different types of content, which is what she needs. She doesn't need more damage. That's why it was so disappointing to see Mika, not add any additional types of utility aside from more damage. Eula didn't actually need more damage. She has a good amount of damage. Her team damage, when you invest in her properly, is very much in line with even top tier other DPSs if you invest really, really heavily into her artifacts. But what she needs is more team utility, such as an off-field non-animal grouper, maybe an electro grouper that can also proc superconduct, maybe a cryo grouper that can also battery her. She needs something like that to really buff, or maybe an off-field physical damage dealing character that's also a cryo battery, or that can also provide superconduct. Something like this that actually synergizes with her and provides more utility than just providing more damage. That's what Eula really, really needs. And I do think it's possible we get it. I have a crackpot theory that Hoyoverse has a plan to redeem physical. We're not going to talk about that here, but I really do think it's possible at some point. Finally, for Overworld and aesthetic. Her aesthetic is one of the best in the game. People love this character, love the design of this character. I love it too. She looks absolutely spectacular. Incredible outfit, Really, really well designed, great voice lines. I love her characterization. I love her animations. She's very satisfying to play. She's very fun. Really no misses there. Hoyoverse very rarely misses. And for Overworld, again, ER is going to be the biggest thing. I would slap an ER Sands, maybe even an ER weapon on her if you want to be using her burst in the Overworld. Otherwise, you can just rely on chunking with her normal attacks. You're going to be defeating enemy mobs just fine, especially since a lot of Overworld mobs have a decreased physical resistance, and most human characters do, and a lot of human characters or hilly trails or things like that are in the open world. So she actually does really, really well in the Overworld, not even using her burst. So she's actually a great character for the Overworld. How she feels to play and how strong she feels. How good is this character actually? Right now, although she does good damage, to me, the caveats that you have to work around and the things that you have to do to work around her bring her down in the overall power level versus a lot of other 5-star carries. In the right circumstances, she competes with the other A tier characters, the other tier 1 characters, and she's really, really good. But there are too many circumstances where she doesn't perform as well, such as the ones we talked about earlier, and that can make her feel not so fun to play. When she does work, however, she is extremely satisfying. She is one of my favorite characters to play when she works because she gets such good satisfying burst damage. It's so satisfying to see that big number of HP on the screen go chunk and go almost all the way down, or just see the enemies have a bunch of HP still, and then boom, the chamber is over and you're watching credits roll and you get your 3 stars, right? I just wish that Hoyoverse would give her more supports to synergize with her. Something like we got Farazan for Zhao that solves some of his ER issues, his quality of life issues, like the grouping she provides and the damage. That's what I want for Eula, to make her really feel good to play in more situations. If you want to see how I would rank her on a tier list, well, why don't you check out that video right there, because I rank her on the tier list right there. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.